I want to welcome everybody to the latest IronEdge Group webisode. My name is Andrew. I will be your host today to walk you through Power BI user adoption strategies. So we have got a couple of our senior data analysts on our team that'll be joining us today. We've got Daniel Villarreal and Christian Denise. How do you? I always butcher your last name.
Yeah, it's Denison. It's easier to say than it is to spell, for sure.
So they've both been with us for multiple years, have been working in Power BI for enough time that they remember when the product was terrible and now it's pretty good. And so we're going to walk you guys through what it means to get your users to start using Power BI and for them to get it kind of in the DNA of the organization, which is one of the hardest things to do whenever you're doing a business intelligence program, especially if you're just getting started, whether it's your department, whether it's your organization. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some quick wins and some areas where if you just put a little bit of extra focus, we think you're going to get more user adoption and you're going to get more people providing feedback for the product and people using it to make better decisions and having it take off within your group. So with that being said, we'll kind of start with the beginning of user adoption, which is the business case, right? So one of the things that we really want to touch on whenever we start talking about program management and understanding how to get Power BI off the ground is making the business case to get somebody at a higher level to buy into actually allowing a budget and time and all of those areas so that you can actually get the project done. So Daniel, one of the things that we spend time on the front end is kind of identifying what is the quick win, what are the areas of concern, you know, what do the stakeholders want to see? Like, kind of talk about how we engage with our clients to start that process when we begin to talk about the program management component.
Yeah, so typically whenever we're working with a new client, one thing that we hate to hear is we want Power BI, and there's not really any follow-up after that. If somebody just wants Power BI reports for the concept of implementing a business intelligence program, typically they're not going to get very far. Most of the time, if there is a need or a want from specific business users that require, seeing their data, handling it, being able to use their data in a more streamlined way, that's typically where we find the highest amount of success, because a lot of times for early initiatives, we are eliminating manual processes for someone in HR to constantly have to put together 50 Excel spreadsheets from the past month and generate a report for somebody that needs it by Monday. Typically when you have any sort of business requirement involved with the need for Power BI, and you can kind of vocalize that to anybody who can put a Power BI report together, that's typically a great place to start.
And Christian, when we start that process with our clients, who typically engages with us in the beginning when we're looking at making a business case to start Power BI? Is it the department lead? Are they bringing in the board? Like, where is it kind of at the highest level of organizations? Is it kind of all the way around? Like, where do most organizations start when they're trying to bring decision makers in to make a business case about analytics?
Yeah, so typically in my experience, it's been department leads. They usually have a very particular initiative that they want reporting on, that they want us basically to come in and help build out their environment, gather the user requirements, build out those automatic processes that Daniela mentioned before. And then kind of from there, then they get somewhat stakeholder buy-in from the higher ups, because somebody needs to make the executive decision to move forward with the project.
And usually they'll find some area where they have a hole, right? Where they're spending a significant amount of time, like you guys had just mentioned, like taking manual information in a spreadsheet and converting it and doing something with it, and it takes hours at a time. or multiple people are trying to make decisions off of shared spreadsheets, or they can't get reports out of their ERP or their inventory management software or their HR software quick enough without having to go through like a Crystal Reports building process, and it's all paginated and static. And so I think what we typically find, and when we start talking about making the business case in order to get user adoption and program management, is to start in an area where you know you can get a quick win, where you can begin a process that shows immediate value, and that at the department level, when you're taking that to get it funded at the stakeholder level or shareholder level, or even beyond the department level, you can sit down and say, look, we see that there's going to be a cost savings or an increase in productivity, and really isolating that as like your first step instead of trying to do everything. You're like, I'm going to do Power BI, right? Like I'm going to create this whole system. It's like, start with one place where you can make a case that you're going to be able to change the way that people do their job and save them time and create a more productive work environment with more accurate decision making. And I think that is where you can latch onto to begin the process of creating a program. And when we go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say, to kind of go off of what you were saying, when people approach us, they do tend to have the idea that Power BI is a magic bullet. But then as soon as we start digging into and finding those lacks, they realize, okay, there's quite a bit more back-end work that needs to go into it, as well as organizing the troops essentially to kind of work towards, the overall user adoption and also owning their particular data sets moving forward, especially at the departmental level.
And that's a perfect dovetail into kind of our next topic, is just kind of where to start and process mapping, because I think where you all have seen this in every Power BI engagement. I even talked to a client yesterday because they're starting down this journey, and they actually had kind of, before they had engaged us, they had begun the process of identifying a specific report that they wanted, and they had started to kind of build it themselves. And as we talked about what their next steps were, there was a lot that nobody really had taken into account, to your point, Christian. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit. Like, what we look at is like data entry, like, where does the data go? How does it get in? How do you curate it? What are the steps? What are the processes? In the current iteration of the reporting, right? Or how the data gets put in the system and how you extract it.
Right. So usually when that's the case, a good starting point is to kind of just start the whole user requirement process, right? So figuring out, okay, where does your data currently lie? Is it Excel files and SharePoint? Is it, distributed over a whole department? Everybody has their own version that they try to work off and report off of. Is there any consolidation that we can do? Are there extensive manual processes, like Daniel's point earlier, where we would actually need to build out like an automation process, either through proper ETL process in their SQL database, for example, or a Power Automate to iterate through API pages, for example, and then actually from there get those business requirements, figuring out, okay, hey, we need to see these metrics. All right, where do we find this data? Can we maybe, like I mentioned, consolidate this to like a data warehouse or something like that? And then just process map from, okay, the source all the way through to the requirements, and then all the way through to actually which KPIs are important to the department moving forward. And from there on, we can actually start having constructive conversations about, what their current reporting looks like as well. And I think that covers the majority of what I usually face. Anything else, Daniel?
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of like sum up kind of the worthwhile approach to beginning, a Power BI journey. A lot of companies have moved over to agile development, but there's a lot of, really important topics that the systems development lifecycle of, the old days can hold for a lot of people. Starting a project, typically, you've got to set up your process diagrams, your entity relationship diagrams, your data flow diagrams. A lot of those things can really inform in the development of these artifacts, can inform how data actually comes together, because typically in these agile workplaces where a lot of people wear many different hats, they're handling the data in manipulating it in ways that differ from their own colleagues and people who use the data themselves as well. So system, main artifacts that are typically associated with the SDLC, can really be leveraged to a high degree here, because the moment you start putting together our current processes and everybody is able to see it from a bird's eye view, what our current process in reporting is, that can really inform what the pain points are. We can identify, okay, well, this automated process at the very beginning, no one even knows about it because, Clara and HR does it without any recognition or anything like that, but that's a crucial part of it. If we can lower the overhead required for that process and move it to a central repository, we're already eliminating a lot of different points of failure for this data's accuracy and reliability.
Well, and it comes back to your audience too. Like once you get all the way through the process mapping, one of the things that we do touch on in that process mapping, just to kind of, I would jump in real quick, and sorry to interrupt, but I think it's really important because this happens all the time, is not just like from a beginning to end, like where's the data sourcing from, like kind of all the way out to visualization. But some of the conversations we've had with our clients is, how are you going to like distribute this information and how do you want to secure it? That is like, even before you get to the point where you start, as we'll talk about, like creating your common languages and understanding what your proof of concept is going to look like, and or MVP or whatever, like we want to know at the very beginning what hierarchical like data looks like when it comes to this, because there may be data that you don't want shared. You may want it published in a very specific way. I think it's important to understand like the audience of that in the process mapping, so that when you're starting to create this framework, it's important to build that into the DNA of how the data model is created and how the visualizations are going to be constructed and how you do that from the jump. Because I think if you ignore that step, you wind up wasting a lot of time in looking at your common languages and what the MVP is going to look like, because you may be looking at data measures or visualizations or functionality that may not be important to the core audience that you're trying to get to in that original stakeholder conversation that you're having for business buy-in, right? Mm-hmm. That's just something I've seen.
Exactly. And, typically it's a fine line in choosing your audience and being able to develop for them, because typically C-suite reporting is kind of a very high level bird's eye view of the company, whereas operational reporting for department heads and department members, typically that's a very granular view of the data on a day-to-day basis. So being able to identify that early on will inform how you need to structure the process moving forward for any potential proof of concepts or MVPs that you may be implementing. So it's extremely important to identify your audience as well.
So once you've identified the audience and you have an idea of what your business unit, the process that you're going to tackle, then it comes to creating this common language. Something that we talk about a lot with our clients, because, well, I mean, I'll let you guys talk about it because you all are the ones that deal with it on a regular basis, but I think it comes back down to just making sure we're all saying the same things in the same way, because at some point we're going to have to apply math, and math is not as fluid as the English language when it comes to certain things. And so we want to make sure that we're clear, right? Mm-hmm.
So something we see a lot, and it's typically one of the first steps in a formal engagement with some of our clients, is at the same time that we're mapping out the current processes, uncovering some unknown sequences of how data is handled. One thing we'll uncover is that two people that sit right next to each other at work are implementing a formula or a KPI in completely different ways. Maybe they'll, allocate a lot of data in an Excel spreadsheet that typically is regarded as raw data. And then the moment that they summarize it and work with all the data, they've got that summarized version of a KPI. Whereas their colleague who sits right next to them aggregates all of the data first and then starts implementing some of these KPIs. And the next thing, one thing that they don't realize is they're using these insights that they generate for themselves that are completely different. Revenue, in some cases, for some employees over the past 3 months can differ by a large magnitude depending on how they're implementing this data. So something that we find extremely important is to get everyone together who has expertise on the data, subject matter experts, to come together and define a lot of these KPIs and a lot of how this data is named, to make sure everybody's on the same page of what the data means and what to call it. You know, there's been so many cases where a KPI has just spiraled out of control and gained new meaning for smaller subcultures within an organization. And taking a step back and creating a common language will just allow you to, even after you've developed your first or second report, to move that common language through multiple reports in the future. And you've already set yourself up for success because there's not going to be any rewrites on what a definition is.
And Christian, I think that in developing this common language, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, or provide some input here. I think that when you do that and you've got that buy-in and everybody agrees on it, the user adoption increases because it reduces your need for people to come back and be like, well, this isn't right. This doesn't match up with what I normally see, right? Because we see that a lot, don't we?
Right, no, exactly. Especially like we see this a lot with the data validation side of things. That's when usually these gremlins start popping up a lot. Because then we would be looking at old reports to validate. We'll look at the database, and then as well as, obviously the stuff that we've developed. And then we come across all of these different issues because of either there was like confusion on what, let's say, for example, they're typing their type of incidents or whatever. There might be a different definition for one department than the other, but at an organizational level, it is one particular defined metric, right? So essentially, we need to roll up to the organizational level. So like to your point, I think that, yeah, it definitely removes a lot of the ambiguity and confusion. It's kind of like the old adage, keep it simple, stupid. So as long as the users and the main stakeholders, as well as the VPs who in some cases might see this and actually use it to make decisions, are all on the same page, that's kind of the key takeaway from the common language. And this comes down to also, like I was saying earlier, about consolidating all your data sources into a single place, because then it makes it easy for other users, and in the spirit of Power BI, to self-service and develop their own reports as well, because then there's no guesswork.
And what we're trying, again, we'll reiterate here, what we're trying to do is to provide everyone an understanding that if you're trying to implement Power BI in your organization or your department, that it should really be looked at as a programmatic approach. It's not a project. It's not like we're going to do a Power BI project and all of a sudden we're going to have some Power BI. Like, it doesn't work like that. Microsoft will obviously allow you to buy their licensing, but you're not going to find as much value in it, and you're not going to get the user adoption without taking some steps up front to understand what people's common languages are, understanding what the business processes are that get the data to and from where it's going to go, how you want those visuals to look. And that all will increase the speed by which people begin to use the product and give you feedback. And so that kind of brings us up to the next stage in the user adoption, which is one of the things that I really like when it comes to Power BI, which is your MVP or your proof of concept. And some organizations will take this to different levels, and I'll give the team an opportunity here to chime in on it. But the anecdote that I have is always, I've seen lots and lots of CIOs in the past that have either gotten in a lot of hot water or even lost their jobs because they weren't able to draw data in a meaningful way out of a new ERP implementation, or out of a promised database upgrade, or putting in a new reporting infrastructure. And one of the ways that we have noticed that the way that we are developing the Power BI platform moving forward is creating a system, as Daniel had mentioned, a lot like Agile, where you're able to get something in front of a usable product in front of somebody quickly that's at that stakeholder level, so they can give you that quick iterative feedback. And that's where the MVP really comes in handy, because if you've identified what that business process is, you've identified what some of these key metrics and data points are that you want to be measuring, then you want to kind of create something as quickly as possible to get it in the hands of people so they can say, I like this, I don't like this.
Exactly. And, there's kind of like three main things you're looking for in the proof of concept that, it's easy to fail fast with. Generally, we're going back to our business case. Some like any sort of process or desire for reporting to be available to people, that's typically what we're going to be using for our proof of concept. And what the proof of concept allows for is to, before you go on any overhauls of your backend data systems, we can use data that is readily available and start generating visuals for users immediately. And at the same time that we're sort of scoping out what a new process or new data architecture may look like that can empower Power BI for the future, we're also presenting the audience with visuals and new experiences in Power BI that allow them to look at it, say exactly what they don't want to see and exactly what they do want to see, and start to understand our audience a little bit more. Because what we found time and time again is you can't get feedback on something people don't want to look at in the first place. So you have to, what the proof of concept allows is a very low overhead approach to giving your audience a sample of Power BI and all of its functionality. And immediately you're given feedback that if they're not looking at it, there's obviously nothing compelling there. And you can start to iterate upon the design and the way metrics are coming together, and overall the user stories and how you're presenting the data to people. And typically, once you start creating some compelling user stories, then you'll start getting feedback that is the most crucial, which is design or feature requests and design requests from your users, because that means you've now got an engaged audience. And as soon as you have that engaged audience, that's where you can start using their feedback as almost like blurbs on the back of a book to say, this department's loving it. Now we're going to go take this to a board meeting and show them exactly what this is. And hopefully by the end of the proof of concept, we have a lot of executive buy-in, and people are starting to really clamor for the functionality that we were able to uncover in the proof of concept. Because the proof of concept, to kind of reiterate, is all about getting the users engaged, and it's not about overhauling your data culture yet, because really what it's all about is showing what Power BI can do for a specific subset of users after you've identified that audience and identified exactly what they need to kind of make their lives easier on a day-to-day basis.
And Christian, how long does it typically take for us to, or for what is a good time frame for trying to get an MVP or a proof of concept in the hands of someone after you've established kind of the front end frameworking that typically happens? Like, what do you guys aim for in order to try to make sure that there's no lag in engagement when it comes to the shareholders and the department leads?
Yeah, so depending on data accessibility, data sources, I've had run-ins with APIs that might take a little bit longer, but more often than not, I have a working product out in front of a client, in between 4 and 6 weeks. So it's not super short, but it's also not terribly long, like a full-fledged fixed scope project. And usually that identifies within that time frame, it identifies lacks too in either their processes, data for particular metrics that they'd like to see in this POC. So then I can go back and we can have a discussion about, okay, how do we get this data, right? And that goes back to the process map that we had before, where, okay, now we can kind of see, okay, we need to pull this data from here, get it in, build out the metrics. And then from there, usually we get some really good feedback, because that's usually when they start approaching stakeholders and executives to get increased buy-in into using this. Well, not necessarily the proof of concept to use it since it's not production ready, but at least take a look at it, get exposure to Power BI and the capabilities that it does have to improve their reporting.
The tactility of the product too is what I think makes it the most important part of the MVP. Is, normally in reporting you would have SSRS reports and or paginated reports, and you have PDF data, or you have static reports and graphs that you'll see. This really allows you to be able to give people a chance to interact with the data, and I think that, to me, that's the point where people are like, it changes things. To me, it reminds me of I like to buy, not just lately, but I buy a lot of vinyl. I have my entire life. because I like the tactility of music. I like the ability of opening the sleeve and reading things and holding my album and stuff. And I think the digital sounds great. It's not a sound thing for me. It's the experience of being able to interact physically with something that I really enjoy. And I think when it comes to business, for people to be able to interact with their data in that way changes the way that they look at their data processes, data curation, right? Like all these different business things that before were kind of like black boxes, like you said. Mm-hmm. Now it starts to make sense to them. They're like, well, if I'm clicking into this, I'm moving this around. What does this mean? They get excited. I've seen it.
Yeah.
Typically, I like to relate it to a few things, and typically with going back to SSAS, they use the word perspectives a lot because it's certain ways that the data can be interpreted. However, there's still a lot of abstraction between general data users and the people putting together these perspectives and views for a lot of these users. And in SSRS, and even other paginated reporting systems, you have to kind of request how you want to see the data and your own perspective of the data in your hands. But I've kind of adopted the word perspective as a Power BI developer because it's really the moment a user sees for the first time the ability to shift perspectives on the same piece of data is really when they start to understand the power of Power BI. Because the moment that they're able to see a organizational level view right in front of them on their screen with all of the same KPIs, but with about 3 clicks and maybe one control click. I know that's a little bit difficult for some users, but just after a few clicks, they're able to shift the perspective on the same page to a singular department in a singular region and with a singular manager to get insights on them immediately. It's all there without having to request a new paginated report, without having to request a new SSAS cube or a new perspective in their SSAS implementation. And, it's all immediate. The moment that someone sees that they can go from an extremely high level to an extremely low level, and then even change their perspective horizontally, laterally to look at finer levels of detail from something that was a pie chart, but is now a table right in front of them with all of the records that populate that pie chart. The moment a user experiences that the first time is really when they kind of the light bulb goes off in their head and they're like, Power BI is something I really want to start using.
And actually, sorry, last follow-up. No.
Yeah, no, sure.
So I actually also had the opposite of the example that Daniel just mentioned, where they went from a pie chart to more, granular data. I've had clients that were exclusively working out of Excel in a very tabular format, and they just have their minds absolutely blown once you put things on like a trending chart or a gauge, to check sales against goals. So yeah, and I think the tactility of it all really kind of ties it together for them, because now, again, kind of in the spirit of self-service that Power BI lauds itself on is kind of coming to fruition again.
And that comes back to once you've got people engaged, once you've got people interested, once you've got people interacting with the data, then you begin to establish this culture within the organization of making decisions around the data, or the processes that are in place have to support the data entry and the cleanliness of the data and maintaining the data and the accessibility and the security of the data. And all of that starts to kind of change the way that the company functions, mostly in a positive way. I haven't seen it where it's grossly negative. It's going to be a little more cumbersome in some ways, but the input side of it becomes way more important than a lot of people used to actually realize. And then when they move all the way through from like the cultural part of it is they're not running by intuition, or as I say, flying by gut feel. They're flying by instrumentation, and it will accelerate the things in a company that matter, because that's what they say, that which gets measured gets done, right? And so that's kind of like the next step, is that now you begin to establish this data culture, right? And
yeah, so I think when it comes to establishing a culture of data, once users start using the reports, even beyond a POC, it kind of, to a degree, gives them a sense of ownership of the data. For example, I've had a client where it was the backend data was all Excel files in SharePoint, and it was just an absolute mess. But this particular point of contact on the client side decided, hey, I want this to be efficient. I want this to be accurate. I want this to be clean and easy to refresh and maintain. So she went ahead and actually cleaned up all of the backend data on her own time, cleaned it, and now the report is actually refreshing as it should without failure, and the data is actually good quality data. And this report is being viewed by their VPs, actually all the way up to the C-suite. And everybody's just been like super stoked about it.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about reliability, which is kind of what Christian was kind of hinting towards. Reliability in the data is something that really drives user adoption. And it's one thing for users to see kind of a simulacrum of their KPIs and metrics implemented in a proof of concept. But when it really comes down to it, what Power BI is meant for is driving business decisions. And you can't make well-informed decisions with unreliable data. So establishing a culture of data cleanliness and data action really is talking about increasing the reliability of data, because we've encountered so many organizations that the executives want nothing more than to rely on pulling up a report in the middle of a meeting. But if the data isn't reliable, then they can't really trust it too much. And to ensure you have a reliable data set or report really comes down to how much are you willing to put forth to make sure that your back-end architectures, the processes you have on handling this data is sanitary and is generating clean data. And one thing I've noticed is there are two approaches really for adopting a culture of data. One, is the classic way of high spend, high reward, but there's also a lot of organizations out there that we've worked with that have a lot of success in, using the tools they have available to them through whether it's the Power Platform with O365 or any developers they may have on staff. A very low spend is kind of required for a lot of sanitization processes for their ETL pipelines. And it's really just the willingness to put forth the effort on adopting that data culture, streamlining a lot of processes, making sure your data is clean, and that really increases reliability and therefore makes users rely a little bit more on the data. It really doesn't have to be a large amount of spend either. It's one thing we have to reiterate.
Yeah, and what I want to know is how much is Daniel going to get from Christian for using the word simulacrum in a sentence? I'm sure he tried to get him to slip that word in. He's like, if I can use this in a sentence, $5. $5 if I can use this in a sentence in our podcast. I swear to God.
I've been watching a lot of science fiction.
Yeah, I was like, I gotta go look up that word up.
I know. I feel like for the foul language that comes out of my mouth, I do have a fairly decent vocabulary, and I was like, I don't what. Good job, dude.
Yeah, I gotta get on the New York Times games. Really boost your vocabulary.
I'm using Wordle, so I'm it's 5-letter words, right?
I'm mainlining crosswords on a daily basis. So.
I need to. Wordle's a gateway, I guess. I need to move up. I need to move my game up to something a little stronger. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about is all the different steps to get to user adoption, right? Which is kind of where we're going to land as we're kind of moving towards the end of our conversation here today. And that's the next step is you've spent all this time creating processes and putting together an MVP, a minimal viable product, and then you move towards getting it out into production, and people are starting to use it, and it's great. Now you've created this this kind of infancy culture of data and self-service when it comes to the reporting. And then what happens next, right? Like where do you guys all of a sudden see things where it's clicking and user adoption is happening and it's beginning to be self-perpetuating, right? What is that next step? What do you guys see there?
So
yeah, go ahead.
So for me, when we talk about iterative development and user adoption as a whole, it really comes down to two things for me. It's keeping the audience engaged, which is the name of the game, really. It's if you don't have an engaged audience, there's nothing to deliver them. Additionally, iterative development doesn't only have to be inside of your Power BI tenancy. Now that you've established a culture of data for your organization, iterative development could be on what data repositories are we using? What technologies can we start implementing to make our data refreshes faster? How can we start automating a lot more of these processes that we sacrificed for our MVP? They're kind of artifacts left over. Iterative development can take place in many places, but empowering iterative development is really the trickiest subject, because you can't have, 8 reports out there for different audiences without a mechanism to generate that user feedback. If people are using it in a vacuum and not being able to deliver any feature requests, feature updates, anything like that, then you're not going to be able to keep your audience engaged, because they'll kind of find a way to get those insights elsewhere. Or maybe one thing we've seen a few times is the disastrous case of some business analysts getting a little too big for their britches and attempting to derive from the current data set and build their own report, and they start operating on some unreliable data or miscalculated KPIs, and that's something that really needs to be avoided. So if you're getting that feedback from your users, if you have any mechanisms, whether it's email tickets, whether it's having a project coordinator speak to users on a regular basis, that's something you really want to set up so that you can keep adding these new pages, new reports, streamlining reports. Going bigger isn't always better either. Being able to combine a lot of your reports to speak to multiple audiences at once, that's a major part of iterative development for me.
Yeah, and I think it kind of thinking about the whole concept of being flexible, right? Because change is already hard in a business, but yet business and industry changes all the time, and so does your reporting needs. So with this flexibility built into the iterative development process, you can also stay at the kind of like the cutting edge of your business, essentially, because you're getting like the latest data from like their latest programs that you might be using. And then actually, I do also have an example of exactly this whole process. So we have a client that I did a particular project for one of the smaller departments, but then they got immense buy-in from their one of the VPs that actually presented the report to their board. And then now the board is super on board, and they've been asking, basically reporting for all of the departments under them, under a lot of these VPs, and to get better, more quote unquote cutting edge reporting and data on their metrics, so they can make better decisions as each quarter progresses. Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, I mean, but it speaks to the idea that you have around once the people start to adopt the Power BI platform and the reports, and they're able to quickly get feedback, and those feature requests are implemented or they're created in backlogs, so you can start doing pull through and you can start getting stuff done for them in chunks. People will show up to like board meetings and they'll be like, here, and they're going to go through their report, and people in other departments are going to be like, what is that? Where did you get that? That's cool. How do I get that? And they're like, well, this is what we did. And there's a model for that. And that's really like, it's more of like an epidemiological model for infection, right? When it comes to creating user adoption, which is to create something that is of interest and usable, and then identifying people in different areas and in different departments and get them to be like your cheerleaders and get them to start using the product and showing it off to other people so that they can gain buy-in from other places. And then you start to like essentially create this system where everybody wants to participate, right? And so there's a proven methodology to being able to say, great. Like, okay, so in your department, let's pick a couple of stakeholders because you like it, and let's get them excited about using it and get them showing it off and get them using it and giving us feedback on it. You can't just give it out to anybody for user adoption. Like, I think that's one of the most important things to remember is people are like, I tried this already and no one would give me feedback and nobody used the report. It's really key to have a couple of people that are excited about what the report is and how it's going to affect their department, and that they can galvanize others behind it and help aid in that transition from making decisions off of, you know, more static data to this more dynamic way of looking at information and visualizing it. And then once you get those, you know, people that are out there galvanizing and are ecstatic and they're, you know, showing it off to others, then you'll begin to get more and more buy-in, because otherwise it will just be something really cool that kind of sits on a website and people forget about it unless you're actively integrating it into other things and trying to pull people into the conversation of what the data are and how they visualize it and what it's doing for the organization.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about, or was it Daniel? I already forgot what I was going to say. It was good. It was good.
I'm sure it was awesome.
It was good. I thought about it and like, wait.
Well, and so once we get to the point where we've gotten through iterative development, people are using the product, it's awesome. Everybody likes reports. We're like, this is great. Data is being curated. New sources are being integrated. Then you realize, uh-oh, I am a one-man band, or I don't have the team makeup to do some of this analysis. I am unable to access this API because I can't write the code necessary for me to be able to create this connector, or whatever that looks like. I think it's important for people to understand from a user adoption standpoint, you can try to implement a lot of this stuff if you're a one-person shop, right? It's helpful to at least have somebody that's dedicated to it or focused on it, but really you'll want to have more than one person available, because if it becomes widely adopted, you're going to want to scale, and you're going to need to have multiple people that are available to help make sure that the product is working properly, updated, features and functionality that folks are asking for are being integrated. Oh, and on top of that, I remember when we started first using Power BI here 4 or 5 years ago, the ability to do certain things didn't exist in it. And as they've become iterative in their development cycles at Microsoft, where they're coming out with things every couple of weeks that are enhancing the product, there's so much to the product now and to the data universe that Microsoft has in the Power App systems that it's almost impossible for even external consultants to keep up with and continue to work with their clients on a day-to-day basis. So if you're inside your organization, I could imagine that it's going to be really hard to do that. So, one of the things I think it's important to talk about is what kind of teams we typically see in some of our more mature clients that are doing data analysis on a regular basis, and then also kind of what we're seeing where we're almost fully outsourced for those clients and why you would want to work with a consulting company. So like, what do you see, Daniel, when you go into like some of the more fully formed organizations?
So when I go into the fully formed organizations, typically the buy-in is already there. We have quite a lot of roles that people are slotting into, and multiple people can be in one role, or multiple roles can apply to a single person, but it can't be done by just one person. So when we talk about, the roles inside of Power BI, we've got obviously stakeholders and what I bucket as developers. And it typically goes from a data side all the way to kind of a visual and governance side. And going all the way back to the data side, a successful Power BI implementation can really not get super high off the ground without a data engineer. Someone who can work with databases, set up a data warehouse where necessary. I'm not talking about an enterprise level data warehouse, just something to host data that is purely meant for reporting. Data engineers are typically the people that can optimize your reporting by generating views instead of databases that eliminate the need for some Power Query that may get out of control in some of your Power BI reporting. Typically, even really skilled data modelers can't slim down their Power Query, and you're going to need someone who can interface with a database or a data warehouse or automation tools to just move data around and get it into places where you're not going to have timing outs of your refreshes. Because the moment your audience starts seeing refresh failures on a daily basis, they're going to start to disengage with the reporting, because it all goes back to reliability. But moving on, data engineers aren't typically always the most logical people as well. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But then you need a data modeler, someone who knows Power BI and how it ticks. Data modeler is kind of different from data engineers, only because they live a little bit outside of the database. They know how Power BI likes to ingest data, how the relationships need to be formed, and typically they're very strong with DAX coding. And this is where the expertise in the subject matter starts to come in, because a data modeler can be the same person as a business analyst, but without a business analyst as well, someone who can ingest your organizational goals and culture and kind of the subject matter in general. Without a business analyst, someone who is really all about the business, what they know what the users want to see, they know what the executives want to see, and they know what people need to see. Without a business analyst, things are kind of going to move a little bit too much to the data and analytical side, where if you want to get a certain insight, you got to click 7 times and go to a drill through and then navigate to a new place, and
or vanity metrics, right?
Exactly.
So if you have a business analyst, what you'll hear from like a stakeholder is like, I want to see gross revenues. Cool. Like, we can create a card that shows you gross revenues. What does that actually accomplish for you?
Exactly.
What are you trying to get to, right? The business analyst is going to ask those questions.
And the business analyst can really appease the people who are gaining insights and the people who want to see the numbers go up. It's a fine line to watch, but they're going to be looking at the same reports. And without a business analyst to kind of weed through all of the feedback and figure out what's most important, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. And finally, on the developer side, you need someone who's just coordinating everything, someone who's going to govern the entire environment at large, manage permissions, get feedback directly from users, and make it a habit to just deliver those insights to your development team. And it can't be said enough, sometimes these people exist across different departments even. Business analysts / data modelers can exist within their own department. Data engineers can be in IT or your data warehousing team. And even in smaller organizations, these 4 roles can be spread across 3 people with different combinations therein. It's as long as you have people that are comfortable filling in these roles and aren't just doing it begrudgingly, they're going to build a successful environment. However, if you have a lack in any of these areas, typically some things are going to fall through the cracks, and you're going to start to have a more disengaged audience, because it really is a programmatic approach. There's never going to be a proper way that this stuff is set up. And if you think you've crossed a finish line, you have to start looking towards the next one. Otherwise, your Power BI implementation is going to get stale. And without the people to empower it, it will definitely get stale.
I would even go further as to say, I think there's one role that we didn't touch on that I personally, and it can be integrated into the business analyst role, but to me, it's UI UX, right, with the reporting, because like I am notorious for creating spreadsheets that only I understand. And when I share them with people, they're like, this is difficult and weird, right? Or I've created some Power BI reports for myself that I'm embarrassed to show y'all that I use kind of internally because they're just ugly. And I know how to get around in them, but there's no way that if I shared them with other people that they would be even useful or engaging, but they give me what I need, right? So I think that that's important. If you're going to really create user adoption, people are going to want to interact with the data in a way that like, it's not clunky. It's not weird. It's not, to your point, like we're not doing 13 clicks. So all of it kind of comes together, but there is a way, like there's literally like books written on how to display data and like certain form factors that you will put in place in order to prominently display certain types of data in certain ways on the page in order to make it more aesthetically pleasing and engaging from left to right and all this other stuff. So like, I think it's important to know that comes to part of it, because we're not talking anymore about just the back end part of the data, which is all the really important stuff. It's then when it finally gets presented, how does it feel? How does it look? Does it meet brand standards if it's going to be out on the company intranet, right? On top of, is it easy to read and can I understand it and does it make sense to me? Is it labeled properly, right? The analyst will work with the UI UX person if they're not the same person to really come together on that, right?
Yeah, and I would even argue that to a degree, and not part of like the core team necessarily, but even the subject matter experts should be part of that consideration as a whole too, because I can think of like at least 3 projects that without a SME as part of the team, there was no way I would know what I'm even looking at. Nobody to describe whatever the data engineer is pushing my way, nobody to explain, okay, how does this all interrelate? And then obviously I have requirements and user stories, but without somebody to kind of like tie everything together for me, that's where like I found like a gap before as well. But I think it also, to kind of go off of some other points that were made, I think this is where redundancy comes into place as well, because one risk that you do run on a team is if it's a one-man show, wearing all the hats. Because if that person wins the lottery and they decide, okay, hey, I'm going to go fishing, right? Then who's going to take care of that? Then all of the reporting reliability kind of goes out the window, depending on the systems put into place. And if this person was self-taught and have only been doing it for a few days or a few weeks, maybe a few months, then there's no like, the test of time hasn't been there to kind of support that. So just one consideration.
And that's when, obviously if you don't want to spend a bunch of money hiring a team of people to do this sort of thing, it always helps to work with an outside consultancy, right? So there are plenty of them out there. We're one, but it's one of those where you bring in a group of people and help to augment your current team, which happens a lot. Or, there are times where we'll come in and they're like, look, we just want these reports and we're going to give you the SME and the stakeholder, and this is where the data are, go to town. And we'll sit down and we'll help run the entire program, right? So there's varying degrees by which you can engage with an outside consultancy. We call it BI as a service. Others will just call it, consultancy or, bucket of hours or whatever you want to call it. But working with an outside firm that's got experience in the product, that understands where these pitfalls are, that can accelerate the user adoption strategies that we've just talked about, is going to be critical, because if nobody's using the reports, then it's just a bunch of money that's been wasted. And we see that a lot with reporting initiatives where somebody will go off into a hole and they're going to create this EDW and they spend $250,000 and 8 months and there's nothing to show the stakeholders and everybody gets disinterested. And when they finally come out with some reporting, it turns out that the business needs have changed and that reporting isn't as important as this other thing that they were trying to get, or that data wasn't curated properly before it went into the EDW and the ETL stacks need to change because a process changed or an acquisition happened. Like, all these things happen because of time in a business. So the key really to this is speed to market, so to speak, when you're working with this data, getting it out into the user's hands, making sure that it's meaningful, that it's impactful, and that you're getting consistent iterative feedback on it so that you can make changes quickly to it and improve upon it so that people continue to want to consume the reports and put them into daily practice and give you additional feedback on how it's going to make their jobs better. And that's why you want to have a quality team, whether it's internal or external or a little bit of both. That's what's going to help you with your data program. And that's really kind of how to like sum it all up, right? Like to bring it together. So,
just to speak on that a little bit, we've seen business BI as a service take off in many different forms. We've been the primary developers just in perpetuity for certain organizations. There have been organizations we've worked with where, they know what they want to do. They've got very technical users, and realistically, our involvement over time just gets less and less, because as users are exposed to our processes and the way that we handle Power BI development, they're starting to take over those roles and responsibilities on their own because they've seen what a successful approach to Power BI is. And every month we're using less and less hours until realistically they're up and running on their own. And there's multiple ways that Power BI as a service can help a lot of users. And really the benefit comes in the fact that there's no scope. If it involves Power BI and something needs fixing, we typically handle it, whether it's, automating processes, working with the data warehouse, standing up a specific database to empower the reporting. You know, we're really open to it all, and that's what you need in a team. Really, is someone who can be as flexible to accomplish any goal that serves the programmatic development of your Power BI implementation. And it can't be understated that your Power BI implementation, even though there's a website that says powerbi.com, you've got a tendency, it is all of the surrounding technologies. It's not just powerbi.com that, you know, will create a successful environment.
And to that point, one of the things that we'll kind of start wrapping up here around is the agile. When we talk about being agile, right, there's a lot of, you know, obviously it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, depending on how your organization is implementing it. But when we look at it, what we're really trying to say is from a month to month basis with a client, what is driving their business from a features and functionality or an improvement standpoint? Because although we've roadmapped out, let's say that, you know, we're working on some sort of a report on project management, and that we were told in May that this component of the report needed to be updated, whether it was, you know, burn rate on, you know, monies coming in for the projects, or whether it was, you know, utilization for team members on the project, whatever. It could turn out that suddenly the client is like, look, we've actually just found this new software that we're going to be using, and we need to integrate this API, and we want to have this time field that's being added based on this outside source. That gets moved up. That doesn't change anything. The hours are the hours, and that gives us the ability to say, okay, cool, we're going to move at the speed of your business, rather than going into a hole and saying, well, that's not on the roadmap for this month. We can't do that, right? Like being able to pivot is an important part of making sure that the user adoption moves in the right direction, because things change in business pretty quickly, as we've all seen historically, but especially in the last couple of years, right? It's an important part of making sure that you're working with the right partner, or that your team is built in such a way that allows them to intake the business needs and move them around as necessary, as part of that iterative feedback cycle and that agile development. Otherwise, if you have people waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks, or months and months and months for something that's critical to their business right now, they will disengage from the product, and your user adoption will lag, right?
And I think the benefit there too is, you know, for the case you just mentioned, where a new technology is introduced and they want to implement it as quickly as possible, with our service, BI as a service, one pair of hands can become two, you know, just by allocating a few hours to another resource. You know, it's really easy for us to, you know, turn, you know, that amount of spend from one person to two people, and kind of shift things into overdrive on our side. Because, you know, if we need 2 or 3 people working on, you know, this joint effort, while, you know, someone's continuing report development, while someone's implementing a new data system or integrating it into your, you know, ingestion, we can do that, because realistically, there's no boundary on leveraging the team, as long as we have the availability. If it's there, it's yours.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I'm feeling good that we've probably touched on way more than we should have when it comes to user adoption. We've kind of gone deep and wide on it. I think as we talk to our marketing team, we talked to Haley about kind of this particular topic. I think we could probably go in depth in every one of these areas for an hour to talk about, you know, what the team makeup needs to be, and how you start developing an MVP, and, you know, how you deal with process mapping. So that might be stuff that we'll approach in the future. But if there's, you know, any additional questions or anything that our audience has for us, feel free to reach out. We're available to answer your questions, or to engage with your organization if you're curious about moving down this road with Power BI, and starting to create a program around it, and what user adoption would look like for y'all. So I want to say thank you to Daniel and Christian for their time and their wisdom and intelligence. It's obvious they know what they're talking about. So I appreciate y'all, and we'll call it a day. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you later. Bye, everybody.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.